Wow, this is incredible. I hope everybody can hear me. We were having some technical difficulties before, but just to see, like, from Singapore to Mexico City to Conway to Brooklyn to all of this is unbelievable. So hello to everyone. I'm so happy to see you all. Kansas City. Crazy. This is some Zoom magic, I guess. Wow. So yeah, I am going to start just by reading from my book. So I'm going to read like just for about, I'm going to read just a few sections that kind of skip from place to place. And so the book takes place in a hospital room in a labor and delivery ward in St. Luke's Hospital near Columbus Circle. And it's two women, veteran humanitarian workers that have known each other for decades. And one of them is giving birth and the other is watching and kind of meditating on what's going on. And most of the book takes place in her mind and memory and going back over what they've been through and what it all means. So I'm gonna just read. Tess walked to the door and flipped the switch. So the only light was the red-green glow of the monitors, monitoring the quickening pace of the heart as Laura leaned forward and another contraction came on. Tess watched her eyes lose focus, all attention turned inward, the uterine walls tightening, pressing, opening the cervix. Laura emitted low groans. Tess stood up and walked over to her, put a hand on Laura's head and grabbed her left hand in hers, squeezing, letting Laura squeeze, looking down at her friend's face, contorted and hurting. Tess listened to the vacancies in her own chest, wondering what sounds she would make if her uterine walls were contracting and wanted to crawl out of her skin at the thought. She lay a hand on Laura's sacrum as the nurse had done, and at the same time tried to feel within herself the place where this was happening, womb. It made her wince. Okay, so now I'm gonna move forward. So this is the moment when they met, Laura and Tess, in the summer of 1999 in Macedonia. This takes place on the border between Macedonia and Kosovo during the airstrikes of 1999. Laura had arrived a few weeks before from Kinshasa and had no idea about the former Yugoslavia. To Tess, it was home. She'd already been working in Bosnia for 3 years, had flown in from Sarajevo, where she'd lived with her brother the last 2. Before that, Banja Luka. It felt like hers by then. Not only her little apartment on Tačića Sokak, but the language she called Bosnian or Serbian or Croatian, depending on who she was talking to, or it was just your language, sometimes even ours. Laughing at the inside jokes of her Bosnian friends, the bands and movies, remnants of the old multi-ethnic socialist utopia. Even Vardar, the name of the river they passed on the way to the border, she'd seen it, but knew the name from old songs. It was swathed in a glow of associations Laura wouldn't understand. But all that faded as Tess saw 3 women trudging up from the edge of the forest toward the razor wire barrier 100 meters downhill. She watched Laura interrogate the guards at the checkpoint and envied her ability to keep calm as the sullen Macedonians shrugged and more men, women, and children gathered on the slope. I should write my questions in lipstick across my breasts, Laura said. Then maybe he'd pay attention. Tess and Laura were friends by the time they drove back into the city, before Tess started her contract, and they were up at dawn to run from site to site through the blazing heat of the summer. Then nights drinking cold wine on the top floor of the house up on Vodno, with its balcony overlooking the kidney-shaped pool next door. Sitting there after the endless days, cursing the clenched throat of Tony Blair as he promised more aid, until the unbearable heat would finally subside under the whir of the Apaches that hovered above downtown. We should go on strike, Tess said. Tell them fuck your relief budgets, we're not going to fight your war for you. Laura nodded and smiled as she refilled their glasses. Exactly, let everyone starve, then they'll understand. It was the first time Tess had been under pressure like that, but Laura had believed in her right from the start. You can do this, Laura told her, you'll be great. When Tess had never seen real conflict before. The Dayton peace agreement was already in effect by the time she got to Bosnia. The work in Sarajevo was just pushing through process, return, and resettlement. Then everyone rinsing their heads in the basements and bars of the city. But now Tess found herself in a situation that was really happening right now. Adrenaline shot through her veins as she and Laura raced around in those white 4x4s out to the camps along the border, kept an eye on the black market networks in the western mountains, occasionally escaping for a mad dash to Ohrid, DJ sets in caves and pink trout flipping in the lake, then in a rush back to the office to grab gear, corral staff, meet engineers, assess land grades, as fields filled up with more and more tarps and tents. The backup in no man's land, rainfall on fetid corpses until the borders opened, and then they couldn't build camps fast enough. Tess ended up in mountain villages, bribing Mukhtars to house the overflow. They'd fix the road, build a school, whatever, but please, she said, house these people, they have nowhere to go. Until the bombs stopped dropping and everyone came down from the mountain and the camps cleared overnight. No one knew what was happening, if there would be mines and booby traps, but the refugees didn't care. They headed home as fast as they could and the camps vacated overnight. Now there were new problems across the border: poisoned wells, unsafe houses, the dead and injured to be tended to, returnees settling scores, vengeance, more killing and confusion. Max showed up from Sarajevo, Laura headed to Pristina, and Tess stayed on in Skopje to administrate logistics. Her boss in DC called in with details for endless invoices. Sign, 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 he told her. We need to get those supply lines moving. She signed order after order, huge shipments of lumber and medical equipment and vehicles. For weeks, she signed whatever came across her desk. Sign, her boss told her. Only when the CIA auditors scheduled a meeting and her boss's line in DC went dead did she realize he and the local procurement officer had been collaborating on an embezzlement scheme. Tess was implicated and finally fired because of her signature on all those invoices. Sign, sign, sign. The adrenaline now froze in her veins. As she and Max packed up the house on Vodno, Laura called in on the sat phone from Pristina, describing columns of Serb tanks, soldiers flashing nationalist symbols as they paraded toward the border with Serbia proper, toward the small towns and isolated villages where Tess would find her next job. Contracts one after another. Meeting Laura again in Cairo, then in Istanbul, where they'd be colleagues in the late 2000s, those murderous years that seem quiet now because they came before all the uprisings. Okay, so I'm going to read 2 more sections, short. This is in Garden City in Cairo in around 2005, 2008. Tess believed there was a scar left on everyone who passed through the Balkans, on her and what she thought of as her generation, anyone who had participated in the supposed relief effort, a fleck in the eye, a reminder that nothing is going to get better, that any attempts to help will only be perverse, unproductive, anti-productive, and finally absurd. There were those who fell in love and who stayed on and made a life for themselves, but most moved on to other lives, like Tess and Laura here now in Garden City. But the scar was there too, that fleck in the eye. So Tess wanted to know what the intelligence in Laura's cheeks could offer, or her own. What were they distracted from Serbian and Arabic and new people and cities to explore and discover, populations in movement, the traffic in the city, circling and circling around Tahrir, which they crossed daily, the many lines of traffic as if they were about to be squashed like the frog in the old 80s video game, not imagining what was soon to happen in that place, only to get to this apartment in Garden City, curving lanes with little gates here and there designed by the English to prevent insurrection. The light over the Nile and the years in between them. To sit at the table finally, drink tea or Egyptian wine, joke about the news, about the people they knew, about a situation with a traffic cop that afternoon, what he'd said to Laura. He'd stopped traffic, she laughed, saying, "How can I work when I'm staring at the moon?" All those Arabic poems about a woman's face like the moon, those cliches. I mean, he really said that, a cop. She could always come here to Laura, and that was good. As long as Laura was in town or around, as long as this situation lasted, which it wouldn't go on forever, of course, for any of them. Not being able to predict where they would be in a year, if they would still know each other, be in touch. For now they laughed through the afternoon light, orange orb falling through the pollution across the Nile, chemical fumes rising up from the buildings, the towers, and apartment houses, all somehow the same color as Belgrade and Sarajevo too. Okay, one last bit. in Istanbul. So yeah, you can see like the sun went down and now it's completely dark behind me. Anyway, this is clear to all of you, but anyway. All right. Laura had always seemed larger and more physically powerful than the men around her, even if that made no sense. That bald merchant marine in Istanbul, sailing from Libya to Kotor to Cyprus. His head was so red and his eyes so huge and shaded. Ugly as sin, Laura said with a laugh. And all their bodies entwined, from Kansas City to Portland to Milan to Banja Luka. That first season in Bosnia, entwined like Laura in heart monitor wires, thrashing and pressing, all of them pressing together. That particular loneliness, waking up somewhere and feeling perfectly alone, getting a new job somewhere and feeling perfectly alone, the blotches and discolorations and abrasions, imprints of car seats and sofas, that motherly feeling sometimes when they come. Yes, baby, that's it. A laugh in it too, at their pride and vulnerability. All for this state that Laura was in, swollen and heaving, awash in these sweet and sour smells, the galloping heart of the unborn. Something that was in them, that spoke through them, whether they wanted it to or not. A continuation of their own movement from here to there to there. As Tess grew older and less deluded and learned to sit in one place and feel the navel of the world grow around her, newcomers would appear with the same hunger and ignorance to scour and discard, to go out thinking they would find something or get away from something or become something. Tess in the green plastic chair could feel the heaviness of her hips, her sharp hip bones that pointed forward, her lower lip falling open. Laura on the hospital bed thrashing heroically, this thrashing that ran through them. Even birth was a thrashing, squatting, rolling over, laying down, standing up, moving hips back and forth, pressing against something, pressing back against something. It was an amoebic form of reds and oranges, and it was greater than her, inside and outside, working through her body, unthinking, which is what made Tess go to Bosnia and Egypt and Turkey, and was even why she was here with her friend. She needed to be here and needed to go there in order to be here. She was sure of that, watching Laura's face and her eyes shut and her mouth. Okay. So these are my sections. I hope there was audio. I have no idea. Okay, good. I got a thumbs up. That's very nice. Anyway, so this is what I have to read from To Remain Nameless for tonight. And so I want to introduce Wayne, and Wayne's going to read a little bit, and then we're going to chat, and it's going to be much freer. So just by way of introduction, so Wayne is not only a fabulous writer and a wonderful person, but he's also a kind of mentor. Like, I've been Wayne's student, and there's something very meaningful to me about doing this event together. And so I feel like it's worth saying my personal experience of working with Wayne has been that he kind of shows me that the way to be the best reader or writer that I might be is kind of listening closely to the desires and pleasures that I feel and all of their jaggedness and complexity. And somehow by listening and moving in and owning up and giving in, you find like something hilarious, something luxurious, maybe a style, maybe an ethics, maybe secretly in there, there's a politics, even a religion, and a relationship to history, all of these things. So anyway, that's what I have to say about Wayne. So, and Figure It Out, which is fabulous, you will hear a bit from. So I'll pass the mic to Wayne.
Thank you. Brad, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
You are good. Brad, you're so fabulous. First, let me say, I have been nominally your teacher, but it's clear that when you arrived that you hardly needed to be taught, that you were an entirely formed, imaginative writer and critic. And the pleasure, I can say to you all, the pleasure of beholding week after week, the treasures that Brad would unfurl, really perfect. He was in a class where students wrote 2-page things every week. They could be quite novelistic. And every week, Brad would have one of these compositions each came from a different country. And so at first I thought, how many Brads are there? How old are you? How could you have had so many lives for all these stories? And I kept on mentioning names like Moravia and Bolaño, because they seemed, everything in Brad's work seemed to come from a slightly wearied or jaded sensibility. There was already, before the scene of writing, a sense of great fatigue and needing to grab the self and the tendrils of history and experience together and say something. And the things that would come out were always plated, P-L-A-I-T-E-D, together as if in a dream, with bits of Peru and Egypt, but believable. Also, like José Saramago is the other novelist I probably was always mentioned, where Brad seemed to be in all of his fictions recomposing a world through the optic or point of view of one nearly posthumous traveler or survivor. That comes out beautifully in this book. And so Brad and I, in a way, could not be more different as writers in terms of our topics, our tones. But I think the thing we have in common, and I hope to exemplify in these little passages I read from my book, is a kind of fetishistic, pleased relation to individual sentences, and a certain fastidiousness and meticulousness, and a sense of being in our writing governed by our ear primarily. Not that all the other stuff cooperates, but the ear comes first almost. The pleasure of hearing a phrase move from one's bottom nature, as Gertrude Stein would have put it. Yeah. Hearing the phrase, putting it down, putting it next to another phrase, going on another voyage, coming back to that phrase, putting it next to something else, being really scrupulous about examining the phrases that one has written, but quite permissive in letting them be written. And, you know, a quilter, a plater, a weaver, and a skeptic. And I think Brad and I have those characteristics. I'm much more of a performer of the self than Brad is. Brad is a real fiction writer in a way that I'm only a fake fiction writer to some extent. So I think Brad is that you're wholeheartedly putting yourself into your characters and their destinies. And at least Brad, the autobiographical Brad, doesn't quite show up, which is, I think, means that you can go on and write many, 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 many novels. And I get the sense that you already have. This is known as the debut novel, but it's not the first. We'll talk about that more in the Q&A. But what an honor to share this launch with you, Brad, of your wonderful book. So I'm going to read three passages from three different essays in Figure It Out. The first passage is from an essay called Of Smells. And it's the end of the essay where I explain my debt to Montaigne's essays. Smell is syntax, is grammar, is the copula, the copulating verb, the intercourse sign of equals, the stink of equivalence, the stink of enforced likeness and its pleasures, whether fecal or ambrosial. Anywhere I go with smell, and we can go everywhere with smell, I owe to the permissive powers of the copula, the is, the stick shift in neutral power of olfactory suggestiveness. We could therefore call smell the whore of grammar, or the fall into false closure, or the rapid departure into cloud consciousness, or a sudden dilapidation. Smell locks us into words, but also helps us to escape them. Annex, what I took from Montaigne. From Montaigne, I took hairy armpits. I took mustache. I took the desire to smell of nothing. I took perfume, incense, seasoning, gender. I took brevity. I took casualness. I took a tourist's tone. I took sex. Sex I can take from anywhere. I don't need Montaigne for sex, but I'm glad to find it in his sentences. From Montaigne, I took disgust, sex's doppelganger. From Montaigne, I took randomness and decisiveness. I took easy movement. I took permissiveness toward in medias res. We enter an idea in its middle. We leave before the idea can reach completion. We lean into the idea from above or below. We don't greet the idea directly. 10 cents a dance with the idea. Toward the idea, we express reverence, but also eventually dismissiveness. We don't allow the idea to tire us, and we try not to ruin the idea by pressing too hard against its vulnerable surface. And now I shall read 2 paragraphs from the essay entitled My New Glasses, which are no longer new, and dear reader, I'm wearing them right now. They're not as fabulous as when I bought them. I thought they were really life-changing, and they don't look really any different from the glasses I wore when I was in 5th grade, but they're more expensive. So they needed an essay. And I'll just read you 2 paragraphs from the essay. Don't get too excited about your glasses. We may need to kill you. Who is scolding me? Some schoolyard bully? A warden who wants to scapegoat me for disseminating what I once called fag ideation? I spread fag ideation around like a diptyque room spray to conceal the head farts, as Artaud put it, that normative logic imposes on the trippy dream world of enlarged thought. And then from the end of that essay about my glasses, I love their sleek matte-ness, their lack of shine when inappropriate, and their sudden efflorescence when appropriate. The alternation of shine, not shine, a polite counterpoint. The sides don't shine, but if I wiggle my head, the shine emerges and then disappears. A sliced hard-boiled egg's cold flatness resembles the matte sheen of my eyeglass wings, their flight toward the sectioned and the mesa-like, or toward Prague deco furniture, not as stern as the Bauhaus, but lopped off, like most modernist pleasures. In the spirit of Barbara Herrnstein Smith's phrase, the senile sublime, or of Willem de Kooning's late paintings, let's reconceptualize mental slowness as a form of intelligence. Let's reroute lunacy toward the parallelogram. Imagine what the Jetsons might have chosen for dining room furniture if they'd lived in Prague in 1922, and if their cartoon heads hadn't been filled with Sputnik propaganda, but instead had been programmed with Kafka. Thanks. And now to close, I'm going to read just 1 paragraph from the essay Punctuation, in which I talk about the punctuation in various works of literature, and I combine my thinking about the punctuation with other thoughts. I'm actually going to read, it's actually 2 paragraphs. Recently, I made a painting based on the penis of my friend Brian, an art critic. My technique was to drag a pencil through a layer of drying but still wet gesso, as if the pencil were a carving tool and the gesso were marble. On Twitter, Brian circulated a photograph of my painting, which he called in his tweet, a painting of my D. D was lowercase, my D. Lowercase d sounds less sexual than the word dick. Lowercase d demonumentalizes the dick. After the D, Brian put no period. A sentence without a comma is often a glorious thing. Washington Irving begins the final paragraph of his essay, The Art of Bookmaking, with such a sentence, commaless, and therefore at liberty to please any visitor, however paranoid. Quote, the librarian now stepped up to me and demanded whether I had a card of admission, unquote. Though I have no card of admission to the Palace of Art, I drag my pencil through drying gesso. I like the resistance offered by gesso en route to marmorialization. Jane Jacobs, in her classic The Death and Life of Great American Cities, speaks in favor not of the marmoreal, but of the various. Variety, she argues, makes for safety. In a list, its noun phrases separated by commas, Jacobs lays out the floor plan of throng consciousness, of Heimlich conviviality. And here's Jane Jacobs's sentence. The floor of the building in which this book is being written is occupied also by a health club with a gym, a firm of ecclesiastical decorators, an insurgent Democratic Party reform club, a Liberal Party political club, a music society, an accordionists association, a retired importer who sells maté by mail. That's Brad, I think. A retired importer who sells maté by mail. A man who sells paper and who also takes care of shipping the maté. A dental laboratory, a studio for watercolor lessons, and a maker of costume jewelry, unquote. I am most interested in the maté, a caffeinated beverage I've never tasted. Call it the unheard melody of Jacobs's building. The maté is where I listen most keenly because I can't hear maté, can't taste it, can't remember it, can't picture it. Maté is the most conspicuously foreign element in Jacobs's sentence. Maté, to which Jacobs gives the unrequired benefit of an acute accent, enlivens any community, linguistic or social, in which it dwells. To become the maté in someone else's sentence, to become the substance that circulates through an unidentified building, to become, as it were, the Keef, K-I-F, of a social theorist's consciousness. Is this my newest aspiration? Or am I content to be a painter of D, a writer who drags his pencil through gesso? Gesso's fumes, the internet assures me, aren't poisonous. Though they assault my nostrils with a sting I associate with the ammonia that porn emporia use to clean spunk off their floors. Okay, Brad, now let's have a conversation.
Yeah.
Okay?
Oh my God. This is, I mean, Wayne, I feel like you must have done this before, but this is so bizarre to me, this whole situation. And watching you and I, in my way of seeing this, it's like my very noir, monochrome kind of sullen thing, and your very pink with the paintings. It's so perfect, and I just can't get over, like, I see the boathouse in Inwood, I see Jackson Heights, I see Los Angeles, I see all these worlds coming at me. It's incredibly bizarre. I see my family. Anyway, unbelievable. But there's something about this happening and these works coming together that are also following these kinds of threads through experience that's mind-boggling.
Can I ask you then, what you're describing there about like all the currents of one's life coming together in this strange virtual form is so close, obviously, to the structure of your book, where you have a very intense, very long scene of childbirth that lasts for the entire book, intercut with a kind of kaleidoscope of memories of through several consciousnesses, but mostly as I read it, from the consciousness of not the woman giving birth, but the friend of hers, Tess, who visits her and kind of acts as the de facto doula for the event. And so I guess I was curious about, like,
unwilling doula.
Excuse me?
The involuntary doula.
Involuntary. That's a great title.
The reluctant doula.
The reluctant doula. So my question is, I don't want to, questions are tyrannical, so I don't want to ask it as a question. But I am curious about that, many things, what it was like to live within the rigor of writing a book that, at least in its later stages of revision, had that cinematic montage, and what it meant to you philosophically or spiritually to counterpoise international devastation and vagabond humanitarians within that devastation, with this scene in New York of a primal but very particularized giving birth.
Yeah, I mean, so what a thing to say, Wayne. Oh my God. Yeah, I mean, this book came from so many things, obviously, but there is a particular thing that of just Esther, who some of you know, my partner, who was a birth doula and was constantly being called away to the hospital randomly at any time, day or night, and then showing up like 36 hours later, all in a whirl with like a couple of beers and a half of a chicken, and being like, you won't believe what happened, and telling me these incredible epic stories of people falling apart in the face of this everyday experience that shreds everyone's protective layers. And so it was just like a pedal point in our life. It was constantly either about to happen or had just happened. And then there was one birth of a very close friend of mine where I got dragged into the room and was there and watched from start to finish this event. And then, you know, a couple of weeks later, just like I saw this, I was kind of like the form of the birth as a storytelling frame seemed to me, I couldn't believe that no one had really done it. And it seemed such a perfect thing to ask all questions about existence and put pressure on everything and make everything matter. So to have somebody who had been so heartbroken and so devastated and had been so pessimistic for so many years be forced to confront somebody that they cared about giving birth and bringing life into the world seemed to me just the perfect staging ground for all the things that I wanted to think about.
Wow. And did you, there's so many things I want to ask about that, but kind of going back to the parts that aren't the birth parts, because that's such a beautiful answer to how the birth parts came. How many places do you talk about in this book? How many places do these characters travel? How did you come upon a narrative style that you have mastered and display beautifully in this book of in these short, often fragments through a kind of litany or flow? You have movements from beverage to city to crisis, and everything is particular, but everything is en route to somewhere else. And so it's like a panoramic view that's also like a modernist imagist poem, particular, general. Like, what was the writing of that like? How did you make that?
So I feel like the main, so I wrote it very fast. The first draft I wrote very fast. And there was something about this once, so I wrote the first 15 pages and was like, okay, this is a book. I understood what it was somehow in over the course of a morning, something that had never happened to me. I mean, I have struggled and been so confused and never gotten anywhere. And I felt like I'd never had an idea in my whole life. And I probably, my way of writing has always been not having an idea. And I'm sure will continue to be like that. But so somehow this crystallized in some way, but then there was this element of having this person talking to themselves, telling themselves a story, going over memory and experience and everything. And so how do you inhabit that without first laying everything? So there has to be some static and noise where you're just thrust into this world, and it's the reference, you're not clear about what all the references are, but you just start to feel comfortable in that. And so that was my main thing, was about how to make it accessible, but still true to that experience.
Yeah. There's a sentence that you, I'm now trying to find it. I wrote it down on a little pad. There's a sentence that you have, something about being like a windsock floating a windsock floating on a tree outside a carnival. It's near the end of the book. And when I read that, I thought that is everything. That is the allegory for everything in this book. The position of ruined man or woman human. That's the word. Ruined human, outside of, observing, trying to cure. Can you say something about that image or avoid the question?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things of trying to get at that feeling of loss, of just loss after loss after loss, and somehow that this kind of ecstatic nature of loss and heartbreak, and that the relentlessness of that. And so, I mean, there's a million, I think, attempts. I feel like that image. It's a windsock at the edge of a carnival. It's right at the very end after the birth has happened, and it's just like, I mean, who remembers how things come to you? I don't know. I have no idea. But
windsock is windsock even a word? That's what's so great about it. I'd never heard of windsock.
I think, isn't that one of those things that like tells you which direction the wind is going, that might be multicolored, kind of like parachute material that's flowing somewhere? So it's just like wind passes through it, it's nothing. So it's like that becomes this way of being a human, is just nothing. The wind is passing through. And so, yeah, that was.
But what makes it, again, like, just to lean on this point a little more, to give you the praise that you deserve in this context, the word windsock is both instantly comprehensible and looks like a neologism. And so that it's the opposite of a cliche. You've created this image. It's a little bit like Yeats or whatever, who talks like a bag of bones. There's one famous poem where Yeats talks about like the human being like a bag of bones on a hanger. It's a little, but it's as original. It's as original as that. I think of you, Brad, as a very fluent writer, always in a state of writing. Can you say something about your moods when you write?
Who wants to talk about my moods? But what can I say about that? My God.
Do you write in a state? I guess what I mean is writing for you, I intuit that writing for you, as it often is for me, is a state of high energy, of escape from most strictures of society and of the human contract.
Well, I feel like, and this is what I was trying to say when I was introducing you, or trying to say something about what I feel like maybe learned from you, is this sense of trying to sink into what is some kind of pleasure pain point that you can feel, that you can kind of work around, and that will drive your language and give it energy, and maybe something surprising will come from that kind of interaction. So there is a sense of like looking for sore spots and difficulty, and so in that sense, it's almost like, I don't know, it's where if I think of escaping being this sense of like trying to look to the side, and then the thing gets worse, where this is somehow like trying to engage, these.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. I'll end, and then I will ask you one more question, kind of, and then we can move to questions. There's also a phrase in the book where I think you talk about solitary philosophers of extinction, which is it's as beautiful as the windsock. Can you just say something about that phrase?
I mean, that I feel like it's especially right now, right? Like just walking through these deserted cities. I mean, I don't know wherever you all are, but it's very somehow, the vision was of these deserted places, and after everything had happened, and just how to feel about that after the catastrophe, and imagining witnesses, I guess, to that, and that somehow seemed to haunt this character, but also kind of pleasingly placate some kind of paranoid fantasy that she could return to, that was comforting in some way. Yeah.
Do you think you should, in your bio, you should include the phrase "philosopher of extinction"? So, as part of what you do, it seemed to me a beautiful encapsulation of your melancholy, something melancholy in your temperament, and something a word I like to use a lot, eschatological, partly because it has scatological in it, but means
something different. Yeah.
death related, that you have an eschatological temperament.
But so let me ask you something,
Okay.
because the thing that goes through Figure It Out is this. At one point, you talk about creating a guidebook for how to become asemic, and there's this idea keeps coming back of the idea of what I guess what I understand is meaninglessness, and I'm like, I don't know that word. I'm like, it's the opposite of polysemic, having no sense at all. And so first tell me what that means to you, and then I want to ask a follow-up.
I would say asemic means to me, I think Henri Michaud, the mescaline traveler and etc., surrealist poet, used the word, I think, and it's a kind of writing that you see like in the work of Cy Twombly, for example, or even you could see as Jackson Pollock, a kind of linguistic, it's the signs of language without the language backing it up. And for me, what's eloquent, the art that is asemic art, or that is asemic writing, moves me very much, but also thinking of what interests me about these days, at least with language, is that I think that we use language to escape language, or that there, for me in my relation to language, there's always been a kind of, my relation to language as a reader and a writer, a paradox of wanting language so everything can be explained, but wanting language so I can refuse the prison of explanations, and that understanding language to be a kind of, one of those doors that you enter in a department store or at the Graduate Center, a revolving door. A revolving door that never lets you into the building of language. You're always revolving. So I
just spit back out again.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that when I say somewhere in the book that we the experiences that drove us to language are exactly what we try to escape with language. Sounds a little abstract, but it's all very humiliating and real. Maybe it's time for questions, John.
Sure. I've got one for each of you.
Okay.
First one's for Wayne. Wayne, what are the differences in your approach to writing essays and writing poems?
I think the main difference is that when I write a poem, I don't have a purpose, meaning I don't have any notion of occasion whatsoever. I have instead, I'm surrounded by everything that I've been and hope to be and everything I've read. And I'm even surrounded by my unwillingness to write, but I'm entering language in the most naked way. I'm pressing as the character Tess in Brad's novel is pressing against the woman giving birth to try to relieve the pain, but also maybe intensify to make the pain worthwhile and bear fruit, to make the pain bear fruit. And when I write essays, it's usually because I don't have an idea per se, but I have an occasion, something like an occasion. You know, so it's either that literally there has been an invitation to write something, or there's an occasion for speech, which could be as small as somebody asks me a question and I need to answer the question. But there is, I guess, a little bit more of a notion that there will be an immediate receiver of the package. And the receiver doesn't necessarily mean publication, but it means it's speech in an envelope aimed at a listener. And poems, that it's that way too, with an apostrophe. In a poem, oh moon, it's aimed at the moon or whatever. But it's I think that in a poem, I'm aiming at the echo chamber of all of language and me in it.
That's a wonderful answer. Question for Brad. I'd love to hear more about the friendship between Laura and Tess, their differences in personality and attitudes toward the work they do.
Yeah, I mean, it seems ultimately like a lot more fun to be Laura than Tess. She's you know, because we're kind of ultimately allied with Tess in the novel. That's the consciousness that we're more inhabiting, and so you get all of the difficulty of that. And it's Laura has this explosive like kind of, I always imagine just like an irrepressible laughter that runs through the book. And that despite all of the pessimism that Tess kind of is always grinding with, that there's this, yeah, there's a thing that they get when they're together, which results in this kind of maddened, hysterical laughter that has to do with the two of them being together.
I have another one too about Tess.
Okay.
How does Tess, who seems so pessimistic about her work, continue to do the work she does? What drives her to continue?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, why do we go on? My God, you know, I mean, we should just stop. We should all just stop tonight and be done with it. I think it makes a whole lot more sense. So, but still somehow we get up in the morning. So yeah, it's difficult because that work, it draws people for so many different reasons, and there is something that even if you go in without a lot of illusions, there's something about just being confronted with hypocrisy, corruption, cruelty, violence in all of its forms, which is morally exhausting, and that's an aspect of that. And if you don't continuously feel that, you're sick or mad or dead. And so I think, yeah, there, and the whole structure is terrible, everything is toxic. But there is a way, almost, it kind of becomes like the birth conceit in the way that it takes you right to a lot of contradictions that are central to life. And so in some way, why she might go on is because those centering contradictions are the things that make most sense to her.
Another question for Brad, and then one that's for both of you. But for Brad, I'd like to hear more about how the narrative moves between continents and whether that changes the style, or does it change it at all to move?
Yeah, I mean, so there was something in the course of writing where it was very, very tangled at the beginning, the first 20, 30 pages. And there was this moment when I got to Cairo when kind of the rhythm changes, it sinks a little bit. It's about 35 pages into the book. And there was just a different kind of speed, energy that happened in that moment in the book that a lot of things fell into place. And so a lot of the revising process was about trying to keep that sense of tangle, to stay true to that, but also like kind of enjoy the fact that it found its form and its rhythm that was a little easier to deal with. And so that somehow was a change. And so then by the time it starts to, so that's the first like real shift. And once it finds that, it kind of, it keeps that rhythm, I think. When it gets back to Istanbul and it gets to these other places, there's a more discrete movement that it maintains. Where at the first it's very frenetic, also because you're entering this world, this woman's experience that you haven't encountered before. So she's talking about all these places, and you're just like, oh my God, what is she talking about? But whereas a few chapters in, it starts to make sense, and then I mean, part of this way that people make sense of their lives is referring back to things that are in their experience. So in trying to create a narrative where one can enter somebody else's references, there's a lot of static in getting in. And then once you get in, it kind of makes a little bit more sense, I hope.
I actually have one more for you, Brad, before the one for both of you. As you revisit the work, do your experiences with the displacement of others help you navigate the shift in global awareness of the precariousness of place and home?
Oh my God, Nyasha. I mean, you know, talking about this now from here is just, I mean, there's also just the reality of when I started revising this book it was kind of in the height of the refugee crisis of, what was that, 2016, 2017, where you had all of these refugee populations flowing from Greece into Europe, backing up at the border between Kosovo and Macedonia, where I had worked in 1999. It was different people for different reasons, but it was the same borders, the same border stations. There were still people in collective centers displaced from the 90s that were still held there while these new waves come decades later. So to be writing about that with that ongoing was just wrenching. And then now to be thinking about that, being displaced, here I am, we're trying to, like, talking to all of you right now, which is so insane, while everyone is displaced, and thinking about what that means in terms of you know, what's going on right now in northern Syria, or which would make me crazy. So I don't know that helps me navigate anything, but it's certainly part of the awareness of the writing process and having written and thinking about it, how it enters the world and what it's doing.
And then one more question for the both of you. It's one of my favorite questions. How have other languages other than English, formed and informed your writing? Brad, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, everything about I feel like I didn't understand storytelling until I heard stories told in Bosnian or Serbian, a language that I had to work to understand, and pay a lot of attention to how people put details together, and what a tempo was, what it meant to, like, create tension. And so I feel like a lot of my sense of storytelling comes from that concerted listening that has to do with learning languages, and also just the charm that comes through when you get something, you know. It's so satisfying, like, that it brought English in a totally different perspective to me, to try to see it from that way, and what it meant to then be able to work in my own language, which was relatively effortless. So, and I feel like I'm constantly at the edge of my whole adult life has been struggling to learn a new language, one after the other, and always being incompetent, and always not being able to speak, and always not being able to understand, and always being in that space. And so my relationship with language is all about that.
And Wayne, can you speak to that a little bit?
It's just something my father's English is his third language, and though that was the only language of my childhood, it does strike me that growing up in a linguistic household where English was the third language influenced, in some sense, the sense of romance or attachment that I feel to languages that aren't English. But I'm pretty monolingual in a way, so that my relationship to other languages, which do enter my writing, is one of longing and to some extent idealization, so that French, German, and Italian mean everything to me, without me really being able to function very well in any of them, or at all, really, in the latter two. But the sense that things are, in poetry particularly, because that's where I experience other languages, and is reading poetry in bilingual editions, experiencing that the possibility that the old withered ways of experiencing that are in me can be refreshed and revitalized by being born in another language. Just that to have a new experience of cloud through nuage, instead of just being stuck with cloud for the rest of my life. And more and more in my writing, I let myself just leave the foreign word in. I like it better. And I don't think that's touristic. I really don't. I think it's an acknowledgement of how into neighborliness I am, how I want there to be spillage, but also illicit friendships between adjacent words. It's quite concrete. I'll say that one of the happiest writing experiences I've ever had in the last few years has been eavesdropping when not in the United States, in a place where I'm not hearing English, eavesdropping and then writing while I'm eavesdropping, but letting the foreign words and my mishearings of them enter when I'm writing. That's real intoxication.
Well, Brad, Wayne, thank you so much for letting us host you this way. We had wanted to launch To Remain Nameless in one of our stores. We're glad we could still do it from Peru and New York and Connecticut. We have a lot of copies for sale on the site. If you want to order one from us, I hope you will. And keep an eye out for more events like this. But this is just a lot of fun. Thank you for reading and for talking and for letting us host you.
Thank you. And when there's a child on a beach somewhere right now where it's brightly sunny waving at us. That happened. But in the new Zoom convocations. Congratulations, Brad, on your book, which is
congratulations. Yeah. And thank you everybody for coming. This means so much to me. So yeah. And thanks, John, for hosting. And I hope that we get to all celebrate together eventually.
Yes.
My God.
Well, be well, everybody. Be safe and have a good night.
Bye.